the past month or so, I've been going over the Satipatthana Sutta. The Satipatthana Sutta is it's a Pali term. It translates as the Buddha. It's basically the discourse on the four foundations of mindfulness. So anytime you hear the word mindfulness, whether it be mindful-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based relapse prevention, mindfulness-based ethical living, mindful magazine, mindful recovery, all of these things, they all come from this. This is the OG handbook on how to practice mindfulness, essentially. It can be found within the Pali Canon. The Pali Canon is the oldest text that we have available and the ones most closely attributed to what the Buddha actually taught. This particular sutta is found in the Majjhima Nikaya, or the medium-length discourses. It's Majjhima Nikaya 10. So if you were to Google meditation or Buddhism and put in the letters MN 10, you will find this particular sutta. And it goes over all of the foundations or pastures for practicing mindfulness. The first is the body. And the body starts with the breath, then moves from the breath into postures. And from postures, we move into activities of the body. And then from activities of the body, we move into what are called the 32 anatomical parts of the body that the Buddha laid out, and the four elements, and then finally cemetery contemplations. So this is the contemplation of death, essentially. The second foundation is what we're going to talk about tonight. We've been working through the body for the past month. So tonight we're going to talk about the second foundation of mindfulness. The second foundation of mindfulness is what is known as mindfulness of Vedana. Vedana, again, is a Pali term that means feeling tone. So basically tonight we're going to talk about our feelings. How fun. And that can be a little confusing because the word feel or feelings has so many different meanings, and it can get a little confusing. Often when we talk about feelings, we're either talking about sensory feelings. I feel hot, I feel cold, I feel tired, or also often we talk about our emotions as our feelings. You know, I feel angry, or I feel happy, or I feel heartbroken. We also say, I don't feel like having that for dinner tonight. But with Vedana, what we're actually talking about is feeling tone. And it's in the psychology world, it's generally classified as a hedonic tone or valence. So it's just this quality of our experience. It's the qualitative aspect of our experience. And every experience that we will ever have will have one of these three qualities. It will be either pleasant, unpleasant, or neither, so neutral, essentially. And most of our experience, I think, falls into that neutral category, right? It's pretty easy to notice when we're feeling something that's pleasurable or feeling something that's unpleasant. But the neutral aspect, I feel like, doesn't really get a whole lot of attention. But tonight I'm going to talk about why paying attention to our feeling tone is so important. I'd like to talk about what the Buddha said about it, and by paying attention to our feeling tones, we can live more fully. The purpose of being mindful of feeling tone is to just overcome this constant push and pull to our experience. So when we have a pleasant experience, we pull towards that. We want more of the pleasant experience. When we have an unpleasant experience, nobody here likes to feel bad, right? Like, we push away from that pretty hard. And on the surface, Vedana appears like a relatively minor factor of inquiry. And I don't think most of us ever really put too much thought into the qualitative tone of our experience. We kind of just have the experience and then go about our day. So we don't really realize what a window of insight that paying attention to this Vedana or feeling tone can be. And most people, I feel like, often overlook it because they're just not trained to look for it. And that's really where this Satipatthana Sutta comes in handy. This is, like I said, the original discourse on the practice of mindfulness. And you hear mindfulness, it's kind of a buzzword these days. It's literally everywhere. I call it the McMindfulness movement. But this is where it came from. Anything mindfulness-based comes from this sutta. But even though it's often overlooked, Vedana is often overlooked, it's very important to this practice. It's, as I said, the second foundation of mindfulness. It's also the second of what are called the 5 aggregates. And the 5 aggregates are basically the mechanisms of human experience. It's also the 7th link in the 12 links of the chain of dependent origination, which is a whole long, crazy teaching that maybe we'll go into sometime. That'd be fun to do that. But what our feeling tone really is it's kind of the driving force behind our motivations to do most anything. It is the reason we crave, and it is the reason that we can be averse to things. And craving is easy, right? I mean, who here doesn't like to feel good? Cool, I don't see any hands. I think we all are on the same page with that. I think most people prefer feeling good over the alternative. It seems to be the general consensus. And because of just our evolution, that's just what we're wired for. We're wired for survival and not for happiness, essentially. So we're drawn to the pleasant feelings and the things that create those pleasant feelings. And we push away from the things and the situations that lead to us having unpleasant feelings. And again, it's not our fault. It's kind of a design flaw. We just got bad programming. It's like Mind 1.0. And I don't know who designed it, but I could care to have a few words with them about it. But I really feel like this is the upgrade to the system. This practice is the upgrade to the system. But it takes forever. It's like downloading something on dial-up. Just watching it come in. Remember when you used to download pictures on dial-up and you'd get one little line of pixels at a time? That's what this practice feels like sometimes. Sometimes that sucks because sometimes it's like, I just want to feel okay now. Why does this take so long? Again, I didn't design the operating system, and I didn't design the upgrade, but at least the upgrade does work. But again, humans are just pleasure-seeking animals. It's literally in our DNA, just to chase after pleasurable experiences and to avoid painful ones. And a lot of times we go to extreme lengths to do so. We look for the right combinations of things to feel good. If we get the right things and we get the right people and the right circumstances, or we get the right substances, or whatever you look for, then we try, maybe if I get all these things lined up, then I can have a pleasurable experience. And then I can be happy. And I don't know about y'all, but oftentimes I've found that doesn't work. There is no right combination of things for happiness. Unfortunately, anything of the exterior world will not lead to any lasting happiness, because anything out here is impermanent. Any kind of lasting happiness can only really come from within. So this is where this is clinging to pleasure and pushing away from pain that really leads to a lot of addiction. This is really where addiction comes into play. We try to avoid the painful situation, not realizing in the moment that the situation itself is temporary and that we don't really need to put anything on top of it for it to be okay. But we all do this in some way, shape, or form. Some people just go a little harder in the paint, so to speak. So it's really important to be as mindful of this feeling tone as possible, because it's easy to fall into that pleasure trap. In reality, we're not ever actually addicted to a substance. we're addicted to the sensation and the feeling that the substance provides, not the substance itself. So unpleasant Vedana is pretty easy to spot too, right? The unpleasant feeling tone of a situation. I sat a 10-day meditation retreat last year. I was supposed to sit another one this year, but I had to cancel for reasons that were beyond my control. But during this retreat, like, it started out really well, and I was really like getting into the groove. We were sitting for 10 hours a day over the course of 10 days, and for the first 3 days, I was making some good headway. I was hitting what are called the jhanas. These are the states of meditative absorption, and it's kind of like rapturous bliss almost. It feels like energy just shooting through your body, and like you're just elated with bliss. And that was on day 2, I hit that, and I was like, this is amazing. I'm having the best time. And then towards the end of day 3, I started getting this just tremendous pain in my right hip, and it kind of took over the rest of the retreat. I stayed for the whole 10 days, but through excruciating hip pain the entire time. So my entire experience was colored by this unpleasant feeling tone of my hip pain. And it made it really hard to do any like real good practice. I still stuck it out and still managed to get a lot out of that retreat, but that unpleasant feeling tone was really loud on that retreat. I mean, it can also be more subtle than that. Like, have you ever been sitting for meditation and you just feel some slight discomfort, so you just want to shift and move? Yeah, that's unpleasant Vedana. It's like that's that unpleasant feeling tone. We just, even those little micro movements are clinging to pleasure. So it's interesting to watch in our practice how just even those little minor shifts that want to scratch the itch is just our avoiding discomfort. I feel like politics are also a really lovely window into Vedana. If you're invested in a certain party, then it creates a pleasant feeling. You feel good about your decisions and what you're doing and what they're doing. On the opposite side, if you don't like a certain party, it's like, ugh, I don't like this at all. It's just that unpleasant feeling. It's like, ugh. And that shows up in a lot of ways. When we think about politics in particular, like, have you ever thought about why you take a particular stance on a subject? It really all does come down to this feeling tone. Like always, it's whether it's pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. And again, I feel like most of life is in the neutral category because we just don't notice it as much, right? It's really easy to spot pleasurable experiences, and it's really easy to notice when we're having an unpleasurable experience. But when it's just neutral, that's just like normal everyday life. It's like going to the grocery store, doing the dishes, feeding the cat, or driving, most of the time anyway. There can definitely be some unpleasant feeling tone attached to driving. I experienced that one a lot. It's like all of my mindfulness goes out the window in heavy traffic sometimes. And yeah, I think that's just the majority of life, is just that kind of a neutral feeling tone, which is not really noticing any real highs or lows. We're just kind of going through the motions. And in my experience, that can show up kind of like restlessness, or there's some resistance that accompanies that neutral Vedana. That feeling of just needing something or wanting something. Now, you don't even have to know what it is. You're just like, something to make this experience just a little more enjoyable would be awesome. You just have to be careful of what that something is, right? That's the big thing. It's like Alan Watts talked about the backwards law, seeking out a pleasurable experience or trying to turn a negative experience into a pleasurable experience is in itself a negative experience. But just accepting a negative experience as a negative experience is in itself a positive experience. Mm-hmm. But we have the hardest time in the world with that, right? Just accepting the negative as it is, like just letting it be. So often we try to fix or avoid or control the situation. Because if I can't fix it and I can't avoid it, you bet your ass I'm going to try to control it to the best of my ability anyway. And that's why being mindful of this feeling tone is so important. And it's really essential, because if it makes us happy in the moment and we're not mindful, that's when things can get out of hand pretty easily. It's that urge to have the second bowl of ice cream, right? When you're like, oh, I'm already full, but God, that ice cream sounds really good. It was really delicious the first time. And oftentimes it's just even the anticipation. Like, it's not even the ice cream itself. It's just knowing that you could have another bowl of ice cream. Like, ooh, I can get another bowl of ice cream if I want it. Or if we're experiencing the unpleasant feeling tone, we want to change our experience to one that's more pleasurable. And there's nothing wrong with that. Again, this is just the way we're wired. It's not a you thing. It's a all of us thing. We all do it. So, these pleasant feelings are always pulling us, and unpleasant feelings we're always pushing away from the unpleasant feelings. But it's by cultivating this mindfulness of Vedana or feeling tone that we learn to just be content in the present moment, just the way it is, and to be free from preference. And that's really what equanimity is, right? Equanimity is a freedom from preference. It's just being okay with whatever arises, being able to be with any situation, any experience, with a sense of ease, no matter what happens. And it's interesting watching with the feeling tone too, because there's a whole spectrum of feeling tone. It's not just like pleasant or unpleasant. There's like a whole broad spectrum. So say we have a spectrum of 1 to 10 on both pleasant and unpleasant. Well, like a pleasant 2 isn't going to be nearly as noticeable as a pleasant 7 or 8. But an unpleasant 2 can feel like the end of the freaking world sometimes, right? It's like, oh, this is terrible. I'm not feeling this present time experience at all, and I want to change it so badly. So it's important to cultivate this, and now I'd like to talk a little bit about how we can cultivate these feeling tones. Well, fortunately for us, in his infinite wisdom, the Buddha gave us pretty precise and to the point instructions for how to do this. They're not great, but they are to the point. And it's really just knowing that you're feeling it, right? And so it's just observing our experience and saying, this is directly from the Satipatthana Sutta. It says, when feeling a pleasant feeling tone, to know, I feel a pleasant feeling. When feeling an unpleasant feeling, to know, I feel an unpleasant feeling. And when feeling a neutral feeling, to know, I'm feeling a neutral feeling. Like I said, they're not great. And the first time I read that passage, I was a little confused because it seemed too simple. I was like, this can't be all there is to it. But it really is just that simple. It's just slowing down enough to go, oh, this feels like it sucks a little bit. Let's be mindful of that. Or like, oh, this is pretty good. I like this. Maybe this could be a problem. I might like this too much. So this is where that spectrum of feeling tone really comes in. And it can kind of be difficult to suss out at first, but that's why they call it a practice. Over time, you do get better at this. In fact, my daily life, I'll just go, I'll be going through a situation that I don't particularly like, and I'm like, unpleasant Vedana. And it's kind of like just become a thing that I do. It's like just calling it out immediately, like, oh, this is an unpleasant feeling tone, and just being really aware of that. And the Buddha's invitation also comes to monitor the presence or absence of these feelings, right? So, because the feeling tone, the Vedana, is directly linked to what are called the 3 poisons, or the 3 fires. And so, with this, the 3 fires are greed, hatred, and confusion, or delusion, whichever way you want to translate it. So greed has this element of pleasure seeking to it, right? Like wanting more of an experience, clinging, attachment, craving. Hatred has this quality of aversion to it. So we have that pushing away aspect of not wanting to be with whatever experience we're having. And then the delusion is the neutral experience, because often when we're deluded, we don't know that we're deluded. That's pretty common. So this is where we really have to start investigating, really paying attention. And that's really all this practice is just paying attention. Paying attention to the way that the mind works, paying attention to the way that nature is, you know. So as we go through our days, it's really important to pay attention to these feeling tones and to know whether we're operating from a place of greed, whether we're operating from a place of pleasure seeking, or whether we're being averse. You know, so often we just get caught up in it and we don't even realize that we're doing it a lot of times. I know that I've been guilty of that. You know, I'll miss a meal and I'll get hangry, and then I'm operating through hangry for the rest of the day. And like, what's up with you? And I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot to eat. And that's what it is. So again, we're looking for the presence and absence of these states, the presence of greed or the absence of greed, the presence of hatred and the absence of hatred. And then seeing clearly to penetrate through the delusion and to really embrace that neutral feeling tone, because there's a whole range of life out there that we just miss so often because we're looking for the next big hitter on the pleasure scale that we just overlook so much, so many good experiences by just looking over them. You know, the more we practice this, the more we notice that these feeling tones are constantly changing. You know, what can be pleasant in one moment can be unpleasant in the next. Has anybody ever been in a relationship? It can be pleasant in one moment and then unpleasant in the next. Yeah. But being mindful helps us to develop an awareness of the nature of impermanence. Again, everything in the conditioned world, everything in the world itself is impermanent, as are these feeling tones. You know, what can be neutral at one moment can be pleasurable in the next. What can be unpleasurable can be pleasurable. But just noticing this impermanence frees us to let go of our dependence on things being a certain way. Having these expectations, expectations, as they say, are the root of heartache. And that's certainly been my experience. You know, we're not conditioned to pay attention to these feeling zones. I think most of the time we're just caught up in our emotions and not the actual feeling tone behind the experience. So when we begin to pay attention to the feeling tone of an experience, it's kind of like lifting the veil on that experience to see what lies underneath at its most unconditioned level. You know, when we cut through the stories and through the emotions and all the other bullshit, we get to the root of the feeling derived from that experience. And that has the potential to give us really deep insight into our mental states, into the quality of mind. So basically, to put a magnifying glass on Vedana is to really fully know whether an experience is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, and identify which one of those can lead to unskillful action or to skillful action. It's a direct window into the conditioning of our minds and the tendency to push away from what we perceive as unpleasant and to cling to what we perceive as pleasant. And Vedana can be experienced in a few ways. Most often it's from experience through the sense gates, the things that we experience in the physical body, touch, smell, taste, hearing, sight, even the mind. And then there's this, I'm not going to go too much into it, but there's what's known as worldly Vedana and unworldly Vedana. So the worldly Vedana would be the sense gates. It's things of the flesh, basically. Unworldly Vedana is things that we get that aren't of the flesh. Things that we get like coming to a group like this. Renunciation is a big one. Renunciation has been a huge source of a pleasant feeling tone for me to be able to get a handle on some of those things in my life. To say I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm moving past that. It's not necessary. And that was big for me because, as most of you know, I spent quite a bit of my life is in active addiction. I was an alcoholic through my 20s and a heroin addict for most of my 30s. And so renunciation for me was a huge source of unworldly, pleasant feeling tone. Right? In the Salatha Sutta, the Buddha said, when touched with a feeling of pain, the uninstructed worldling sorrows, grieves, and laments, beats his breast, becomes distraught. And so he feels two pains, physical and mental, just as if they were to shoot a man with an arrow and right afterwards they were to shoot him with another one. See that he would feel the pain of two arrows. In the same way, when touched with a feeling of pain, the uninstructed person sorrows, grieves, and laments, beats his breast, and becomes distraught. And so he feels two pains, physical and mental. The discerning person, learned, doesn't sense a mental feeling of pleasure or pain. And this is the difference in skillfulness between the sage and the run-of-the-mill person. For a learned person who has fathomed the Dhamma, clearly seeing this world and the next, desirable things don't charm the mind. Undesirable ones bring no resistance. His acceptance and rejection are scattered, gone to their end, do not exist. Knowing the dustless, sorrowless state, he discerns rightly, has gone beyond becoming to the further shore. And this is what the Buddha referred to as the untrained mind, is the one who's not mindful of these experiences, of this feeling tone, of the breath in the body, and of the other foundations of mindfulness that we'll get to after this talk. Next week, we'll be moving into the third foundation of mindfulness. But so just, again, with this practice of Vedana, we're just learning to train the mind to identify and discern what quality each experience has. It's essentially like monitoring our own internal weather. Some days it's clear skies. Some days it's a bit cloudy. And some days there's like a Cat 5 hurricane and it's an absolute shit show. So it's really essential on the path to just pay attention to these feeling tones and simply note, without any stories attached to it, without any judgments, without any narratives or anything, whether it just feels good, whether it doesn't feel good, or whether it's neither. So this, I had a lot of experience with this actually. When I first started doing this group, I had a bit of a fear of public speaking, and it would present itself in the body as just a state of dis-ease. So, has anybody ever been in a situation where you're like, oh, I don't want to do that thing, and like feel like your stomach drop, and you're just like, oh. And it's interesting that this happens because what's actually happening is it is our fight, flight, freeze response kicking in, and it's the blood moving away from our organs into our limbs. That's why that stomach feels that way when we're in those situations, because it's basically our blood is evacuating to our limbs just in case we have to run. And it's also interesting to note that fear and excitement show up much the same way. So when I started doing this, I was terribly nervous sitting up here talking in front of a group of people. Extremely nervous. And I had to kind of change the narrative and oh no, you're just excited because you're about to go give a talk and you like that. It's a thing you enjoy. So I was able to kind of flip the script on it and use the unpleasant to fuel the pleasant. So we're just, life's difficult, man. It's really hard. And that's one of the things I really value about this practice is just the recognition of that. And the first noble truth is that life is going to contain a fair amount of suffering. It's going to be hard. And some days are going to be harder than others. Yeah. I'm not quite sure when we got sold this expectation of being happy all the time, right? I'm not quite sure when that happened. But at some point it did. And now we're kind of sold this idea that if you're not happy all the time, that there's something wrong with you. Or that you may have a mental diagnosis, you're bipolar. It's like, oh no, I think you're just a human being. And I think life is incredibly difficult at times. It's really easy to get lost in the pursuit of happiness. Because we all want to be happy, but to expect to be happy all the time is just setting yourself up for suffering. It really is. Because we're not going to be happy all the time. Sometimes our hearts are going to break. If we're not mindful of our feeling tone, we can create all kinds of narratives and stories around it. Have you ever walked into a group of people and just felt uncomfortable? And you're like, oh, none of these people like me. They're all judging me and they're all looking at me. It's interesting how we just can walk into a situation that just feels a little uncomfortable, and then the mind just starts creating these stories. I've felt that more times than I can count. That I don't fit in. That I don't belong. That I was always on the outside looking in. But the more I've really started to pay attention to just the way that the mind works, one of Joseph Goldstein's first teachers, Manindra, had this quote. He said, if you want to learn how the mind works, sit down and take a look at it. And the more that I've done that, the more I've been able to see that feeling tone of unpleasantness arise and kind of get in front of it before any of the stories start happening. Yeah. And I can get in front of those thoughts. Because at the end of the day, thoughts are just thoughts. And they're not our reality most of the time. So I hope that something in that talk has resonated for you, and why it's so important to just pay attention to the hedonic tone of experience, whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, because it really makes such a huge difference in just the way we act in the world, whether we're acting skillfully or unskillfully. And we can see the way that pleasant and unpleasant feeling tone can give rise to both skillful and unskillful actions in the world. And so I've told you what Vedana is, talked about why we do cling to pleasure and push away from pain, talked about what the Buddha had to say about it, and kind of giving you some insight into how to be mindful of feeling tone. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move into a longer practice.